Chicago wasn't always like this. Once a thriving city, now a war zone ruled by the Black Vultures, a ruthless gang led by Vincent Viper Malone. They weren't just criminals, they were terrorists in their own city. Every night, another murder, another robbery, another innocent woman violated. The police? Useless. Either too scared or too corrupt to do anything. The people lived in fear, watching their city rot under gang control. Business owners paid protection money or had their stores burned. Families locked themselves indoors, praying their daughters wouldn't be the next victims. No one could escape the Black Vulture's grip, and those who tried, they ended up in the river, face down, floating, lifeless. Then came Clint Eastwood. A seasoned police officer known for his bravery, no-nonsense attitude, and deadly precision, Clint had spent his career taking down criminals. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, and he never backed down from a fight. Chicago didn't know it yet, but salvation had just arrived. On his first night in the precinct, he saw the fear in the eyes of his fellow officers, the way they avoided talking about the gang, the way they pretended not to hear the screams in the streets. But Clint didn't play that game. So when Emily Carter, a young British woman, stumbled into the police station, her dress torn, her face swollen, Clint knew this was it. She could barely speak, but her trembling voice said enough. She had been attacked, violated, left to die. The officer at the front desk sighed, shaking his head. "We can't do anything, miss. Just go home." Clint clenched his jaw. He had heard enough. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, and looked her in the eye. "You're safe now. I'll handle this." The other officers froze. One of them whispered, "Clint, don't. You don't know what you're getting into." Clint turned slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto his cowardly colleague. "I know exactly what I'm getting into, and it ends tonight." As Emily sobbed, Clint stood tall. He didn't care about the warnings. He didn't care about the risks. He was going to war. Clint Eastwood wasn't a man of empty promises. When he said he'd handle something, he meant it. He wasn't like the rest of the Chicago PD, afraid, corrupt, spineless. He was here to clean up the filth, starting with the Black Vultures. He spent the night reviewing every case file he could find on the gang. The police reports were thin. Most officers didn't dare investigate. But Clint wasn't just any officer. He had seen the worst criminals in his career, but nothing like Vincent Viper Malone. The man was a ghost. No official records, no fingerprints, just a legend whispered in fear. But Clint didn't care. Every legend had an end. By dawn, he had a plan. With Emily Carter's statement, Clint traced her attackers to a nightclub downtown, the Raven's Nest, a place crawling with Viper's men. It was a known criminal headquarters, yet the police never dared to raid it. That was about to change. Clint loaded his Colt .45, strapped his badge to his belt, and walked into the precinct's bullpen. He slammed a warrant onto the captain's desk. "We're raiding the Raven's Nest tonight." The room went silent. Officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Clint's gaze. The captain sighed, rubbing his temples. "Eastwood, you don't understand how things work here. We let them do their thing, and they let us do ours." Clint leaned in, voice deadly cold. "You're scared. I get it. But I'm not. Either we do this together, or I do it alone." Silence. Then one officer stood up. Detective Daniel Briggs, a man known for his morals but also his survival instincts. "I'm with you, Clint." One by one, a few more officers stood. Not all, but enough. Clint nodded. That was all he needed. By nightfall, Clint and his small unit rolled up to the Raven's Nest in unmarked cars. He could hear the pounding bass of the music, the laughter of criminals who thought they were untouchable. That illusion was about to be shattered. As Clint stepped out, a bouncer blocked the door, smirking. "You're not supposed to be here, officer." Clint didn't hesitate. A swift punch to the jaw sent the man crashing to the ground. The other officers took that as their cue, storming the club with weapons drawn. Chaos erupted. Thugs reached for their guns, too late. Shots rang out, bodies hit the floor. Clint moved like a ghost, his precision deadly, his every bullet finding its mark. And then, at the top of the stairs, he saw him. Vincent Viper Malone. Dressed in a slick suit, cigarette between his fingers, he smirked. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Eastwood." Clint leveled his gun at him. "You're done, Malone." Viper simply chuckled. "You think a badge means anything here?" From the shadows, more men emerged. Guns, knives, bats. Outnumbered, surrounded. Clint simply smiled. He loved a fair fight. The room exploded into gunfire. Bullets ripped through the club, shattering bottles, tearing into walls, and sending criminals diving for cover. Clint didn't flinch. He moved like a force of nature, his Colt .45 spitting fire, dropping one thug after another. Briggs and the other officers took cover, fighting back hard, but they were outnumbered. Viper's men were ruthless, well-armed, and willing to die for their boss. Clint didn't have time to waste. His eyes locked onto Viper, who had turned and was heading for the back exit. "Briggs, cover me," Clint shouted. Briggs nodded, laying down suppressive fire as Clint broke into a sprint, dodging bullets as he pursued the city's most feared criminal. Viper burst through the exit, into the dark alley behind the club where a black SUV was waiting. His driver had the door open, engine running. Not happening. Clint fired 3 precise shots. The driver slumped forward, dead. The SUV rolled forward slowly, crashing into a dumpster. Viper turned, pure rage in his eyes. "You just won't quit, huh, Eastwood?" Clint's gun was raised, but Viper lunged at him, knocking the weapon aside. The two men crashed to the ground, fists swinging. It was a brutal fight. Viper was strong, years of ruling the streets making him a ruthless brawler. But Clint was tougher. He had fought worse men, survived worse nights. A sharp knee to Viper's gut sent the gang leader stumbling. Clint followed up with a solid punch to his jaw, sending him crashing against the SUV. Red and blue lights flooded the alley. The rest of the precinct had arrived. Officers stormed out, rounding up what remained of the Black Vultures. Viper, breathing hard, smirked through bloodied lips. "You think you won, Eastwood?" Clint wiped blood from his own mouth, stepping closer. "I know I did." Viper chuckled. "You're too late. This city is already ours. Taking me down won't change a damn thing." Clint grabbed him by the collar, eyes burning with fury. "We'll see about that." As officers slapped cuffs onto Viper and dragged him away, Clint stood tall, looking around. The crime lord was in chains, his empire falling apart, but Clint knew this wasn't over yet. The city was still bleeding. He wasn't done cleaning it up. The city had held its breath for years, trapped under the grip of Viper and his gang. But tonight, everything changed. As Clint Eastwood stood in the dark alley, watching officers drag the broken and bloodied gang leader into the back of a police van, the weight of what had just happened settled on him. The streets were still alive, sirens wailing, radio chatter buzzing, and the dim glow of streetlights illuminating the devastation left behind in the wake of the raid. Bodies of Viper's men littered the area, some still groaning in pain, others completely motionless. Officers worked quickly, securing the scene, collecting evidence, and clearing the debris from the intense gunfight. Crime tape stretched across the club's entrance, a place that had once been a hub of power for the Black Vultures. Now it was nothing more than a war zone. Clint took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. His knuckles were bruised, blood smeared across the side of his face. The last hour had been relentless. Gunfire, hand-to-hand combat, and a chase that had ended with him beating the city's most dangerous criminal into submission. A familiar voice cut through the chaos. "You did it, Eastwood." Detective Briggs approached, holding his bloodied side where a stray bullet had grazed him. His expression was unreadable, a mix of relief, disbelief, and a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. Clint exhaled, shaking his head. "We're not done yet." Briggs nodded. "Number. But this city finally has a fighting chance." The heavy steel doors of the police van slammed shut, locking Viper inside. The gang leader, his once cocky demeanor now replaced with a cold, defeated glare, sat in silence. His bloodied lip curled into a smirk as he locked eyes with Clint through the reinforced glass. "You think this ends with me?" Viper's voice was low, his words dripping with venom. "There will always be another. You clean up one mess, another rises. That's how this city works." Clint took a step closer, hands resting on his belt. He studied the man who had terrorized this city for years, left innocent people broken and afraid. The fear Viper had cultivated, the corruption he had built his empire on, was deeply rooted in every alley, every backroom deal, every dollar exchanged under the table. But Clint Eastwood wasn't afraid. "Maybe," Clint said coolly, "but not today." With that, he turned his back, walking away as the van's engine roared to life. Within hours, Viper would be behind bars, stripped of his power, watching the empire he had built crumble into dust. By sunrise, the news had spread like wildfire. For the first time in years, people walked the streets without fear. Store owners, once forced to pay protection money, opened their shops freely. Mothers, who had once clutched their children tightly while walking past dark alleyways, now breathed easier. The city had seen monsters, but now, for the first time, it had seen a hero. Clint stood outside the police station, arms crossed as he watched reporters scramble to cover the story. His name was already plastered across headlines. The officer who cleaned up the streets. Clint Eastwood, the man who took down a city's worst nightmare. He wasn't in it for the fame, never had been. But as he looked around, seeing the relief on people's faces, the cautious hope beginning to bloom in their eyes, he realized something. He had given the city something it had lost long ago. Hope. The young woman who started it all. The sound of footsteps approached from behind. He turned to see Emma Carter, the young Englishwoman who had come to him that night, begging for justice. She stood before him, her expression different now, no longer terrified, no longer broken. Her eyes held gratitude, strength, and something else Clint rarely saw in people in this city, belief. "You saved my life," she said, voice steady. "You saved so many lives." Clint shifted slightly, adjusting the hat on his head. "I just did my job." Emma smiled softly. "No, you did more than that. You stood up when no one else would." She extended her hand. Clint hesitated for a moment before shaking it firmly. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave her a small nod. "Stay safe, Miss Carter." As she turned and walked away, Clint felt a rare moment of satisfaction. He had done what no one else had dared to do. He had faced the darkness head-on, and he had won. As Clint leaned against his squad car, watching the sun rise over the city, Briggs walked up beside him. "So, what now?" Briggs asked. Clint took a long, deep breath. The city was quiet now, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. There would always be another criminal, another gang, another monster in the shadows. But as long as he was here, as long as he was wearing the badge, they wouldn't stand a chance. He slid into his car, adjusting the rearview mirror before giving Briggs a final look. "Now?" Clint smirked. "Now, we keep the bastards in check." With that, the engine rumbled to life, and Clint Eastwood drove off, leaving behind a city that, for the first time in years, wasn't afraid anymore.